Good morning. If I can get us started here. Hello. He waited as the gradual diminution of the conversation started. Welcome this morning to the King Institute for Faith and Culture. I'm delighted to welcome you, especially today, as we honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Normally we do this event, of course, on the Monday, but this week our visiting speaker is here more conveniently on Friday, so I'm glad you're here on a day that we're not accustomed to doing this. But we are delighted to have Dr. Turner with us. Before I tell you a little bit about him, let me mention that we have some other opportunities to spend time with Dr. Turner. If you'd like to, after the talk this morning, we will go to the Tadlock House on the other side of campus where we'll have coffee and a time to chat. You're very welcome to join us. And after that, you're also welcome to join us for lunch. We'll go at about 11:15. We'll be in the Tipton room in the cafeteria just across the way. And please do join us for any of that if you can. He'll be speaking again tonight at Lee Street Baptist Church at 7 p.m. And then we'll have a few copies for sale of his most recent book, The Harlan Renaissance, about his youth in Harlan, Kentucky. Bill Turner comes from coal country. He comes from Harlan, Kentucky, not so far from here, and he grew up in the hills of Appalachia just like these. And it has been said by many people that he is kind of the grandfather of the academic study of African American experience in Appalachia. The person who said that, in fact, is somebody Bill worked for a while, and you may have heard his name, Alex Haley, who wrote the book Roots, and as well as the autobiography of Malcolm X. You can't write books like that, and you can't have speaking appearances like that without somebody great helping you out. And that's what Bill Turner did for Alex Haley for 10 years. He's also an academic. He spent time teaching at Berea College. He's been at the University of Kentucky, and he's been at Kentucky State University. He has served both as a faculty member and as an administrator. And he's been a writer, not only with his most recent book, The Harlan Renaissance, but he's also written significant books about blacks in Appalachia before this. And he's also done work that is sociological. His training as a sociologist is from Notre Dame University, where he holds the PhD. So he's got a lot of different hats, but one thing that binds them all together is Bill Turner's passion for justice and for equity and for love and for mercy. And I've known him for many years now, and those things come through not only in his professional work, but in his personal life and his personal deportment. And I'm pleased to call him a friend, and I'm delighted to introduce him to you this morning. Please welcome Dr. Bill Turner.
Good morning, everybody. Every time I go somewhere and I get introduced like Martin just introduced to me, and while I didn't look around to see how any of you were reacting in any way to what he said about me, but when you hear somebody introduce you and they say such nice things, it reminds me of a story from my upbringing in the church, Macedonia Baptist Church in Harlan, Kentucky. And it was on the occasion of the funeral of one of our town's most well-known persons. And the eulogist, kind of like Martin, made it sound like this person was Jesus laying there. And he went on and on about the deceased being a mason and an elk and an elder in the community. And he was a man of God who cleaved unto his wife and lusted after no woman. And he was a Boy Scout master and this and that. He went on and on and on. And at a point, the widow, sitting next to her daughter, nudged her and said, "Honey, go up there and see if that's your daddy in that casket." Now, so if my wife were here, she would say, "That's not Bill." So I'm so happy to be here. This is kind of like home to me, Eastern. My parents, my great-grandmother was born a slave in Pennington Gap, Virginia, Lee County. It's about 30 miles from here, probably. My grandmother was born in 1896 in Coburn, Virginia, Wise County. My daddy was born in 1917 in Wise County. My daddy worked in a coal mine in Lynch, Kentucky for 52 years, raised 10 of us. So I'm very thankful to be here. And let me tell you my Martin Luther King story before I get started. How much time do I have? About 30 minutes? Okay. On April the 4th, 1968, at which time I was 21, I'm 77 now, on that night of April the 4th, I was sitting in the King Library, the King Library, at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. At the time, I was the president of the Black Student Union at the University of Kentucky in 1966. And I also had the pleasure of leading regular demonstrations around the University of Kentucky basketball games. That was like declaring there was no God. You ever been to Lexington, Kentucky in basketball? I'm serious. You don't say bad things about Adolph Rupp, boy. But I did. We challenged him. We said, you need some black basketball players around here, man. It's 1966. And you know what? The next year they got stomped by Texas Western, an all-black team, and the players were from New York City. Anyway, somebody comes running in the library and said, Bill, they done killed Dr. King. And I said, oh, my God, they did? Yeah. And at the time, I was also affiliated with an organization that was a partner to the King's agency. It was called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I was a member of a group of students called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Most of us weren't that. You know, some of us were saying, nonviolence ain't gonna get us nowhere. Yeah. In fact, the godfather of our SNCC was Malcolm X. My father would say, they're gonna kill you, boy. And because it was critical times, I don't know, some of you look like you might have been around in 1966. What were you doing? Well, I know what I was doing, and I'm still doing it. Still not afraid of anything. And so when Dr. King was killed on April the 4th, 1968, a gathering had been organized, and the speaker was a man who was very popular in 1968. He lived in Louisville, Kentucky. His name was Cassius Marcellus Clay. And he was going to speak at the University of Kentucky for this campus forum on April the 6th, 1902. He called them and said to them, I'm going to Atlanta to be with the King family. He wasn't called Muhammad Ali yet, you know. So Muhammad said, I'm not coming. So I was a loudmouth president of the Black Student Union, so they asked me to speak in his stead. I said, hey, nothing but a thing. Bring it on. So I stood in front of 12,000 people in the same arena where Rupp used to play basketball. I don't know if Rupp came or not, though. I'm not sure. But the day after that, April the 7th, I went to Atlanta. It was a month before my graduation. I went to Atlanta for Dr. King's funeral, and my friends in SNCC honored me and gave me a shovel, me and 18 other people, boys and girls as we were, and we followed that caisson, is that the way you say that word? We followed that wagon that pulled Dr. King with those mules, and we had to scoop up the mule poop. It was the greatest feeling I ever had in my life. And there was 1 million people in Atlanta that day, and I ended up walking alongside a priest. And at one point he said, what are you going to do after you get out of college next month, Bill? I said, I'm going to go to graduate school right over there. I'm coming back to Atlanta. I'm going to go to Atlanta University. W.E.B. Du Bois was at Atlanta University, and I wanted to go there. And he said to me, how would you like to go to Notre Dame? I said, they have a pretty good football team, don't they? What do I know about Notre Dame? He said, we're much more than a football team. So the reason somebody can call me Dr. William Turner and say I got a doctorate in anthropology at Notre Dame is only because Dr. King shed his blood. They went around and scooped up Negroes like flies and took us everywhere. They took us to Berkeley, to Harvard, to Yale, to Duke, to King University. Is that lady still here that worked in the president's office for 50 years? Yes. We went everywhere as a result of Dr. King. Affirmative action, it was called. So I'm a affirmative action baby if you think so. But since then, I have a daughter and a son and nephews that have graduate degrees and medical degrees, and I don't think they're all that affirmative action anyway. I don't think I was affirmative action. I just got an opportunity. I'm getting off the point. Sorry. Let me start. Thank you, Martin, for inviting me. I think this is, I can't remember how many times. I think I've been here 5 times in the last 20 years, and I'm happy to be back again. The King Institute for Faith and Culture. That's an auspiciously interesting combination to be talking about Dr. Martin Luther King at the King Institute for Faith and Culture, because that's what Martin King was about. And if I could get this thing to move right here. Excuse me, please. So it's a blessed delight to be here, and I want to talk a little bit about this. I have chosen for my presentation this morning the following title. It's called, do you have your pen out? My presentation, did you advertise my title? Good. Oh, you did. It's called Between the Big Dream and the Big Lie. Now, if you don't want to hear anything that might, there's books out about people being fragile on discussions of race. So if you're fragile on discussions of race, you might want to leave. Okay? But I hope we won't have any problems with that. And so let me just get started. There's a big gap in this country right now between Dr. King's dream and the big lies that have invaded America in the last 6 or 7 years. One of the biggest lies is that America's at war with itself. The second biggest lie is you can't trust your neighbor. And the third biggest lie is these colored people and these immigrant people want your stuff. If you grew up in the mountains of the South like I did, every now and then as you ride the routes between Coburn and Big Stone Gap and between Glade Spring and Withville, you'll see a sign that says, "Watch for fallen rocks." That's because a certain Cherokee down around Bryson City in the 1800s went out on a deer hunting trip or something, and he got disoriented and he got lost. And they've been looking for him ever since. His name was Fallen Rocks. The Cherokees have some interesting ways of naming themselves. So there'll be a few things I'll say that might feel like fallen rocks in your head. So when I get to one of those, I'll say, "Watch for falling rocks," okay? I don't intend to leave this morning. Oh, Lord, my... Finished. I am intent to walk away from this podium so that nobody will say, "Did you get his drift? Did you know what he was trying to say?" I pray that when I'm done, it'll be crystal clear, unambiguous, explicit, unequivocal. It'll be the naked truth, I hope. And the naked truth is when something is described in such a way that it is unaltered, it is unadorned, it is bare, it is plain, it is nude. You remember, what I'm about to say is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. That expression goes back to at that time when there was an entity called truth and another entity called untruth, and they were bathing, and when they got out of the river, untruth put on truth's clothes. And rather than put on untruth's clothes, truth decided to go naked. That's where you get the phrase, "That's the naked truth," if you believe Greek mythology. So let me see what we can do about these two, this big lie and the big dream. before a very dignified and an interracial crowd of 275,000 people on August the 28th, 1963, Martin Luther King had a big dream where he said, 80 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand signed the Emancipation Proclamation. That event, called the March on Washington, was so well planned. Nothing was spontaneous in 1963. In fact, the FBI, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the White House orchestrated it. They told King them what time to come to town, what route to come to town on, and they told him what you can say and what you can't say, and they had a plug in the White House that said, if you say something we don't like, we're going to pull the plug, and your amplification is going to go away. If you don't think I'm telling the truth, just go and read about it. James Baldwin, one of the most famous voices of the period, they wouldn't even let Baldwin talk because they knew Baldwin liable to say anything, if you know James Baldwin. Another person that they didn't want him to speak is named John Lewis. Now, we've been venerating good trouble John Lewis lately, but people forget at the time John Lewis was the chairman of SNCC. He followed Stokely Carmichael. And they didn't want John to talk because we don't know what these young radicals might say. And so imagine that in 1968. Decorum was so important, everybody had on a shirt and a tie. Martin Luther King rarely, he was clean as you, brother. Because the church required you represent the whole race. You got to look nice. You got to be nice. And don't say contentious things. Well, skip ahead to 2021, on January the 6th, when a relatively disheveled mob, watch for falling rocks, a relatively disheveled mob showed up on the eclipse. And they had hangs and nooses. They had guns. They desecrated the Capitol. Donald Trump, in the words of Martin Luther King, his mouth was filled with words of interposition and nullification. He egged his followers to overturn the defeat in the previous election and to go up there and disrupt Congress's affirmation of the election. You know, growing up in Eastern Kentucky at a time like this, and I'm looking at y'all, my dad would say, boy, you can hear a gnat pee on cotton. Y'all, loosen up, it's okay. Everybody said, you know, because that's the, where we were that day. What were you doing that day? This won't move right. He called them into action. And his supporters went up there, and they even said, Martin Luther King had talked a few years earlier in 1968 about, we don't want any violence in here. When people left Washington that day, they picked up the paper. There were people there who were intent upon killing the Vice President of the United States. Now, if y'all don't believe me, go back and look at the televisions. Yeah, they said, we want his head. Nancy Pelosi. That's what they said they'd do. Second reality of the big dream, as Dr. King said that day, quote, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society, and he finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to Washington to cash a check. Because for us, when we came to get our part, it said what? Insufficient funds. We don't have enough for y'all. That's what it said. Now, that was 1968, and King said that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were promissory notes. It was like a check. We promise you that this check is good. We had been here by that time 334 years. And he was alluding to that most haunting element of the American dilemma, the specter of slavery, which was grounded in white supremacy. It was grounded in white supremacy. It was Watch for falling rocks. In fact, slavery itself had been upheld most by the Christian church. Isn't that an obvious contradiction? Jesus said, God hath made of one blood all peoples of the earth. Now, King had even written to his pastor friends, brother, from the Birmingham jail. And he had said to them, they had said to him, why do you keep doing this? Why do you keep going to jail? And Martin said, why are you out there? Why aren't you in here with me? If you're a man of God, you should be in here with me. But at the same time, many Christian white churches in the South were in fact founding new schools, separate white schools, because they didn't want to integrate with colored people. Churches founded schools that were deliberately to be all white. 1968, I was 22 years old. I'm 76. Think about what happened in those intervening 55 years in terms of when I watched January the 6th. I'm sorry, when I watched them confirming McCarthy last week. It was the same thing again. I was saying, am I going crazy or what? I've seen this movie before. And in fact, the night after all of the hullabaloo, when they came back to confirm the vote, most of the people in one side of the aisle still voted not to affirm the election. And the very people who had said, we've come to kill you, was right outside still. And then last week, they voted the same way. 22 people held up the whole House of Representatives a week ago. 22 people. Now, who are these people? They are the people that Martin said their mouths are filled with interposition and nullification because they've convinced themselves that somebody's going to take their stuff. Watch for falling rocks. So, in terms of the big lie, at that Save America rally on the Ellipse on January 6, 2021, the ex-president told everybody who didn't vote for him, go over there. If you didn't vote for me, go over there. And not only that, thousands of attendees breached police perimeters and broke into the building, occupied it, vandalized it, and looted it. And these are the people who always talk about family values and law and order. Ain't that a contradiction? The very people killed a policeman. I've said it many times, I'll say it again. If it had been black people occupying the Ellipse that day, there'd be blood all over the walls of the Capitol still. They'd be trying to scrape it off. Because I went to the Million Man March. Y'all remember the Million Man March when Louis Farrakhan, boogie, boogie, boogie. It was 1 million black men on the Ellipse, 1995. I went to it. I took my sons. And you know what? There was no problem at all because there were so many tanks and military equipment around and snipers up on every roof as you could see. I'm wondering sometime, how did these people on January the 6th, 2021 get into Washington and get where they got with the armaments that they had without somebody knowing about it? How did they do that for so long and there was no intervention from the authorities in the form of the National Guard? Who was keeping them away? Those were important questions because that's not over yet. That's not over. Particularly some of you young people in here, I hope you get to be 50 and we'll see which way America's going to go. And it'll go the way we want it to go. In some way, I honor those people who were up there in 2021 because they were moving by their convictions. When I was 18 at the March on Washington, we were moving by our convictions. That's what we believed in. So fine, that's America. You're supposed to do what you believe in. But sometimes it gets outside the rule of law. And nobody should be above the rule of law. So the reality and vision in the big dream, one more, it says, in the same space in 1963 that was occupied in 2021, Dr. King said he refused to believe that the Bank of Justice was bankrupt. By contrast, in 2021, the National Bank of American Democracy was temporarily closed. and the actual physical vaults that held America's currency of freedom and the security of justice were locked down that day, and the invaders defaced some of our most sacred symbols. They urinated and defecated on the floors and the walls, and they erected a hangman's noose. 5 people died, and hundreds of first responders were injured. That was part of what we saw between 1968 and now. When King referred to the big dream of his day, he said, "Now is not the time for the tranquilizing drug of altered reality." King said, "Don't let nobody tell you don't believe your lying eyes." And you know, for a period there starting in 2020, every time you looked around, somebody was telling us not to believe what we were seeing. From the moment of the descent from the golden escalator, watch for falling rocks. There entered into America from that very moment something called altered states of reality. It was Orwellian. People were saying, "Oh no, the facts are altered. It's an altered reality. What you see is not what you really see." And we was going, "Daggone, I've gone crazy. I just saw that." And they told me I didn't see that. Go read George Orwell's 1984 or Animal Farm if you want to. You had to have that in freshman in high school, didn't you? So it says that the House Select Committee has been trying to find a way to figure out what happened, and although we all saw what happened, they had to spend 2 years telling us what we saw. It was an attempt to overthrow the government. That's all it was. Call it what. In fact, there were some people who called it, that was nothing but a regular tour of the Capitol. No kidding. No, y'all done gone crazy. These people are running the country. The inmates have taken over the asylum. By the way, I'm on number 4, contrast between. So if I go to number 10, I'd be wasting y'all's time, but I don't need to go through. Let me go through one more. But I hope you get my drift, and that is to say we have a lot of work to do. When King did his big dream, he said, "Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy." On 2021, January 6th, we were challenged. The speakers decried and they contravened our most sacred democratic principle by mounting a campaign to pressure people to change the votes. They called the governor of Georgia, said, "I need 12,000 more, man. Can you find me 12,000 votes, bro?" Democracy. And since then, I live in the state of Texas. And since then, democracy has taken a different step because these people who run various state legislatures, including Virginia and Tennessee, have passed laws to make it more difficult to vote. I mean, make it more difficult. Don't even want you to vote on a Sunday. And that's when we have something called Souls to the Polls. And you remember what happened in Georgia. It got so weird in Georgia recently, I was saying, I just wonder now how anybody in their right minds could convince somebody to vote for Herschel Walker. I'm sorry, watch for falling prejudice. But I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, that was pitiful. He came that close from being a senator. That close. Heck, the other night, I watched Georgia beat Texas Christian about 75 points in a football game. And see, I'm one of those people who, I don't want to sound like Mr. Santos in New York and say I'm Jewish, but I think the Jews who say never forget this happened. If you forget, your children will never know it. I'll never forget when they integrated the University of Georgia in 1962. Do you know 500 white students rioted in Athens, Georgia, and say, "We'll never have any black people on our campus"? The governor of Georgia. And then all of a sudden they were running Herschel Walker to be the president. Now just imagine how crippling that could be psychologically and emotionally to some students who don't know the history, because we don't teach it to them. In fact, during the last 5 years, a group of people came up with a marvelous program called the 1619 Project to understand what has happened in America in race relations since the first slaves stepped off in Virginia in 1619. Before you could say 1619, some extreme, quote, right-wing people came up with a project called the 1776 Project. We don't need to remember all that nasty stuff about slavery. We don't need to be reminded that George Washington owned 478 slaves. We don't need to be reminded that Thomas Jefferson had a young 15-year-old black girl in his presence for 30 years, had 7 children with her, Thomas Jefferson, Monticello. Because there's certain things we don't want to hear. Heck, I slept last night in the Martha Washington Inn. I said to myself, Lord have mercy. My daddy would say, Billy, you slept in the Martha Washington Inn? I mean, some of you know that that's the way our history used to be, places you could not go unless you were shining shoes. And I'm reminded of it constantly sometime. Can you imagine, Martin, just a few minutes ago on my way here, I stopped at a rinky-dink store to get some Vaseline to put on my face, and a man in there said, where are you preaching at today, buddy? Stereotype. Where are you preaching at today, buddy? I guess he hadn't seen a brother in a blue suit and a bow tie in a long time. But it was just like a microaggression. And I was going, man, Mr. Rainwater, why do you say that to me? Because we haven't gotten away from certain things. Big dream. In 1968, King said, there will neither be rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. Correspondingly, a few years later, on 6 January 21, America, as a relatively stable political space where the transfer of power is a given, has been thrown out. In fact, just last week in Brazil, they did the same thing in São Paulo, where the president, Bolsonaro, is that his name, refused to accept the election. And they're rioting in the streets of São Paulo right now. And you know what they call the former president down there? The Trump of Brazil. I got to just watch the news, y'all. I'm not telling you nothing. I'm not making this up. Don't go out of here saying, oh, I hated him. He had to come in and remind us of the stuff that's in the closet. But I'm just saying, I hope Martin didn't invite me here on the idea that I would come up here and do some Disney version of Martin Luther King. Because Martin Luther King was no Disney character. In fact, I thought I'd never live to see this day, because as I remember when in 1968, you could drive through Tennessee and Virginia and see billboards the size of this building that considered Martin Luther King a communist and the most dangerous man in America. All along the highways and byways, on the top of barns in Chattanooga. Martin Luther King was more despised than Osama bin Laden. Yes, he was. Ronald Reagan didn't even want to sign the thing on that day. Martin Luther King was considered a terrorist, and he was a man of peace. He was a man of peace. During that time, J. Edgar Hoover, y'all remember him? Some of y'all look old as I am. J. Edgar Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI, right? J. Edgar Hoover said, Martin Luther King is the most dangerous man in America. 6 months ago, you know who they said the most dangerous people in America are? QAnon, the Patriots. Same people that was in Washington. Now they're saying uninvolved white males are very dangerous. They feel as though they're going to be replaced. They're the ones who marched through Charlottesville. That was a sacred space. Don't you remember when the Klan marched? Hey, I remember the Klan marching through Harlan County when I was a little boy. But we always knew what a Klan was because we could keep up with them. We knew who they were. Now you don't know who these people are because they wear suits and they're in Congress. Yes, some of them have actually admitted that I belong to this organization. But you have to remember, too, if you're my age or so, throughout the South, they had white citizens' councils in the 60s and the 70s, and the heads of these councils were the mayors, the policemen, the firemen, the first responders. So, as the French say, la plus ça change, la plus la même chose. The more it changes, the more it remains the same. We got a lot of work to do. And you know what? Martin Luther King, in his speech, said in 1968, we can live together as brothers and sisters, or we can die as fools. And you've seen the violence in the past few. If you just want to see what the potential for this violence is, just look at the record of all of the violence with guns that goes on in America every day. A week or so ago in Virginia, I think it was, a 6-year-old shot his teacher. Guns. Don't live in Texas, boy. I went out to Uvalde. And you know, Uvalde is as far from where I live in Houston as it is from here to Baltimore. But I drove out there a couple of days, just said, let me go see what this looks like. I drove to El Paso after a shooting in a Walmart out there 2 or 3 years ago. Shootings. Now, there are roughly 345 million people in America, but there are more than 1 billion guns. And I think that some people are really prepared to use weapons of that kind of destruction to have their way, and they're so afraid of the browning of America. They're so afraid. They're so afraid. It isn't big enough for all of us. They didn't say that when all of the immigrants came from Europe, when their name was Dotterich. I'm sorry, did they? No. Won't let a Haitian off the boat. But that's what we're working on. So the reality is that Dr. King, I want to say, said there's a marvelous new militancy. And he said that we cannot be satisfied until we straighten this out. So I'm going to kind of flip down to the end of what I came to say. I start off by saying I hope it sounds like, oh, I see where he's going. And so where I've been is I've given you a checklist that's contrasted the big lie with the big dream. And freedom, justice, equality, these rolling waters of justice in America have for a moment at least been dammed up behind a wall of lies. But we've also seen some great changes. When I look at the composition of the Supreme Court, it's interesting. When I look at the fact that my daddy's hometown, Coburn, Virginia, has a black sheriff, I said, Lord, have mercy. A Mooney, I think that family is. So this checklist says if you don't already know about these lies, these deceptions, these deceitful fabrications, these falsehoods, these mendacities, these slanders and slurs and spears and smears and untruthfulness, I feel sorry for you. Because if we don't act, if you don't do anything, if you don't get in some good trouble like King would want you to do, and you know, there was a whole lot of white people at the March on Washington. That was not a black affair. A third of those people were white. Yeah, what are you doing? What are you doing? It's time for you to do something. That's what I came to say. These people who looked at these last few years, they are backed by some deep-pocketed people. It takes a lot of money to do some of this stuff, these elections. They're not playing footsie, folks. This is truly an inflection moment, a very transformative period in our times. And the stakes couldn't be higher here in 2023, going toward the election of 2024. And the biggest lie of them all has got people wondering, is he going to run again? And those who are holding him accountable for what happened, there are other people saying the reason they want to hold him accountable is that they know he'll win. because you can't run for president if you've had a felony, right? Watch for falling rocks. It's going to get very, very complicated because there are people who dug their heels in, folks, and they ain't going nowhere. And they're depending on the church. And of course, you know, the evangelical church gave some of those people a free ticket a lot. You know, say, you went along with that? My God. So that's the kind of work that we have to do. But in spite of it all, I remember a song that we used to sing in the 60s called, "We Who Believe in Freedom, We Shall Not Rest. We who believe in freedom, sweet honey in the rock." Go Google that, young folks. Sweet honey in the rocks, we who believe in freedom. So King's dream speech goes on and on. Stop the steal is almost like the obverse of the dream. Stop the steal, stop the dream. That's what that's all about. And we still have a dream that despite the big lie and the sweltering heat of injustice, it's gotten hotter and hotter, and some folks are making it get even Armageddon-like. We believed and we will act in our country's best interests in terms of freedom and justice for all. Like Dr. King, we will ever be convinced that William Cullen Bryant was right. When you press truth to earth with your lie, it will rise again. Truth always rises. William Cullen Bryant. We also know that God is on our side. That's the good part about it. Wade in the water, wade in these lies all you want to. God's going to trouble the water. The big dream will live forever. The big lie will ever die. And I thank you for the invitation. God bless you. God bless the King Institute for Peace and Justice. God bless America. God bless us all. Thank you very much.